In 2019, a man walked into his apartment, he called out to his roommate, he found the lights on, he found food cooking on the stove, the shower was running, and his roommate's phone was open on the table. Everything was normal except for one tiny thing. His roommate was gone and nobody has ever seen him since. It's midnight somewhere, and tonight I have a very special story for you. Before he vanished, Ethan Clark was the kind of person that everybody felt super comfortable around. At 26 years old, he was considered to be very calm, he was level-headed, he was super reliable, and also too, he was a very smart guy. Some people would say that he was slightly introverted, but also at the same time, he was very friendly. He never involved himself in anything dangerous, he hardly drank alcohol, he never did any sorts of drugs or partook in any sort of illegal activity, and on top of that, he wasn't considered by his friends as impulsive or reactive in any way, shape or form. He was super reliable, and that's what his friends and loved ones loved the most about him. Ethan worked as a data analyst for a logistics company, the most routine and predictable job that you could possibly imagine. And just to give you a little bit more of an idea of the type of person that Ethan was, he liked pretty boring things. He loved cooking, he loved late night gaming, he liked true crime documentaries, he really kept to himself, and he also liked going to the gym on the weekends. His parents described him as a quiet and thoughtful type of kid who double checks the front doors before he goes to bed. And his roommate Mark even said that Ethan was probably the least dramatic person he'd ever met in his entire life. So if he disappeared, it wouldn't be by Ethan's choice. Now, Ethan had stability. He had a really great job, he had a nice comfortable apartment, he had money in the bank, he had not a single enemy in the world because everybody genuinely liked Ethan. He also had no mental health history. Absolutely nothing about Ethan suggested that he would ever abandon his life, which is why what happened in 2019 is so deeply disturbing. On March 14th, 2019, Ethan worked a normal 9 to 5 shift. Co-workers saw him through the day drinking coffee on his break, laughing at jokes with his co-workers, doing all the normal type of work stuff that you would do, like responding to emails, discussing with his colleagues about the upcoming project due in the following Monday. Nothing at all was unusual and nothing was strange. At 5:03 p.m, he clocked off for the day, he swiped out of the office building, he said goodbye to the security guard, and he walked towards the bus stop. CCTV footage shows him standing really calmly at the bus stop waiting for the bus. He was scrolling through his phone, he had his earbuds in, and everything was as normal it was on any other type of day. At 5:20, the bus arrived, and just like every other day, he jumped on to make his way home. Everything was ordinary. It was about an hour's bus ride home by the time the bus stopped at all the different bus stops along the way and allowed for the peak hour traffic from all the other workers that were heading home at that time of the day. And at about 6:12 p.m, just before Ethan got home, Ethan decided that he'd text his roommate. And he texted his roommate, "I'm on my way home, I'm going to cook early, I'm feeling pretty tired." And Mark, his roommate, replied, "Sweet, no problems at all, I'll be home at around 8 p.m. And unfortunately, that was the last confirmed message anybody ever received from Ethan. But Mark didn't know that yet. At 6:20 p.m, Ethan's bus arrived at their stop. It wasn't far from his house, and footage shows him stepping off the bus, crossing the street, and walking towards their apartment complex. He looked completely normal. Now, Mark, Ethan's roommate, arrived home at 8:07 p.m. He noticed the odd details immediately. Firstly, the front door wasn't locked. Ethan always locked it, and although they lived in a really safe neighborhood, Ethan always locked the door to their apartment, even when he was at home. The apartment lights were on, but Ethan wasn't in the living room. Ethan's phone was on the kitchen table. It was unlocked. There was also music playing, and there was also a recipe open on his phone of a video on YouTube. Now, there was also a cutting board set on the counter with vegetables half chopped. The paring knife that Ethan was using was sat right beside it. It looked just like someone had stopped cutting mid-slice. There was a pan on the stove and the heat was on low. The oil in the pan was warm, as if the chopped vegetables were right about to be added to the pan. And Ethan had 100% definitely been there recently. Now, while Mark was scanning around and trying to work out where Ethan had gone to or where he was, he heard that the shower was running, and this did annoy him a little bit because Ethan was obviously in the shower and he'd left the stove on with a pan with oil in it, and obviously that's not a very safe thing to do. Mark noticed that the door to the bathroom was actually wide open and there was steam pouring out of the bathroom into the hallway. So when Mark checked the bathroom was completely empty. No towel laid out, no clothes on the floor, no water on the tiles, just a running hot shower with nobody inside. So Mark yelled out, "Hey, Ethan, Ethan!" But there was no response. Every room in the apartment was empty, and the strangest thing was that the entire apartment looked like Ethan had stepped out 30 seconds beforehand, except he was gone. Ethan was nowhere to be seen. So Mark was starting to get really worried at this stage, just because it was so unusual to have the stove on, the door unlocked, the shower running, and Ethan was nowhere to be seen. So naturally he picks up his phone and he tries to call Ethan, but as he calls, he remembered that Ethan's phone is sitting there open on the table. So Mark picks up Ethan's phone and it had a full battery. There was no missed calls other than Mark's call that he just tried to call right at that very moment. And it had no strange messages. There were no alarms set. There were no signs of any sort of distress. And this was also starting to really feed into Mark's anxiety and Mark's worry for his flatmate and friend. So at 8:22, Mark called Ethan's parents. At 8:47, he called the police, who arrived within about 30 minutes. And their reaction was fairly immediate, that something was actually wrong, because no adult, especially not someone like Ethan, leaves a meal cooking, a shower running, an unlocked phone, the front door unlocked, no note, no message, and no explanation as to where he had been. So the officers searched the entire apartment complex. They searched hallways, they searched the stairwells, they checked the roof access, the garbage rooms, the parking lots, and came up with absolutely nothing. There was no sign of Ethan anywhere. So the police eventually pulled the security footage from the building, and here's what they found. At 6:37, Ethan enters the building. He walks inside normally like he does every other day. There's nobody behind him. There's no signs of fear on his face from what they could see from the footage. There's no unusual behavior. He takes the elevator to the 4th floor. Again, something that he does every single day. And the camera shows the elevator's door closing. And unfortunately, that's the last ever confirmed moment that Ethan is ever seen again. Ethan is never seen leaving the building, not through any of the other exits in the building, not through the lobby, not through the emergency exit, the garage, the stairwell, the rooftop, or any camera angle that the building had. He went into the apartment building and he simply never came out. Now, based on the cooking, the phone activity, the shower steam, police estimated that Ethan was in the apartment for less than 12 minutes before Mark came home to find that Ethan actually wasn't there. And what happened in those 12 minutes is completely unknown. There was no sign of struggle, no forced entry, no neighbours heard of any sort of disturbance or anything like that. There was no tampering with the locks. Nothing was missing. There weren't even any fingerprints in the apartment besides Ethan's and Mark's. It's as if the apartment just swallowed him up. So after a lot of police work and a lot of investigation, the police really didn't have much to go on. So they came up with several different theories, all which were quite flawed in one way or another. The first theory was that it was a voluntary disappearance, which is completely impossible considering that Ethan left everything behind, including his phone, his wallet, his keys. He left his food cooking on the stove, the shower running. The second theory was that he actually slipped out unnoticed, but this theory turned out to be impossible because of the camera coverage on the building. Theory 3 was that he had a mental breakdown, which is possible but highly unlikely because there was no real evidence that Ethan was under any sort of pressure that would cause a mental break. He'd always been really happy, rock solid, and was generally happy with his life. Theory 4 was that somebody was actually in the apartment with Ethan, but there was no real evidence to sustain this theory because there was no sign of any sort of struggle. There was nothing stolen, there was no fingerprints other than Ethan's and Mark's, so there wasn't really a lot to go on to sustain that theory. Theory 5 was that he actually climbed out a window, but they lived on the 4th floor. There was no ledges, no handprints, no footprints, and no one falling out of the building was actually reported, and also no cameras picked up anybody leaving on that side of the building. Now, the most haunting detail of all was that a week later, Ethan's mum was given his phone back. In the YouTube search bar, police found the last typed characters, which were WH, just those two letters typed at 6:41 p.m. after he entered the apartment. So the question is, what was he about to search? Was it something like, what was that? Or who's outside? Or why is this happening? Where, when, who? Nobody actually knows. So those two letters are really the only last digital trace of Ethan Clark. So authorities searched for 4 years, but they've never found a body. There's never been any sightings. There's never been any digital activity on any of Ethan's accounts, including his bank accounts and credit cards. He's never been sighted returning to the building. He's never turned up on any traffic cameras. And to date, there's been absolutely no witness reports. Ethan Clark walked into his apartment building at 6:37 p.m. and vanished completely from the world, leaving behind only a lit stove, a running shower, and two typed letters that really reveal nothing. Or I guess they could potentially be revealing everything. So if you like the dark stories told late at night, make sure you subscribe. I drop 3 new mysteries every single week, and I'll see you at midnight.